So in this video, we are going to solve this very unique business requirement, which is, let's say once the sandbox R gets refreshed, IDP should not make any changes and Salesforce sandbox should still be able to log in from IDP. So as we all know that when the sandboxes gets refreshed, SSO gets disabled. Now the question is, what are the some configurations that we need to do so that the identity provider of the refresh sandbox still should be working without much modification. Before I go on the answer, let's go on simple implementation to make things a little bit clear. So as you can see on this lucid chart, I have a two part. What needs to be done in identity provider and what needs to be done in the service provider. So first of all, in identity provider, you have to enable Salesforce as an identity provider. So what I'm going to do is I would be using my Salesforce, one Salesforce instance as identity provider and another Salesforce instance as a service provider. So basically I have one org 29. So I would be using org 29 as an identity provider, and I have kind of one old org which is like Zadev. I'm going to use this as my service provider. So I'm going to my identity provider, and in my identity provider all you have to do is enable identity provider, and you have to say what is the certificate. You download this certificate, and this certificate we are going to use. So if you go here, you enable Salesforce as an identity provider, we download a certificate. Now the third step is we have to create a connected app inside an identity provider. So you go in connected app, and in the connected app, if you see, we have a start URL and we have ACS URL. These URLs are going to be the service provider URL, and this is going to be used in IDP initiated single sign-on. So if someone logins to your identity provider, which is G29, they click on these URLs and they would be automatically get logged in. So as you can see, in my connected app, we have to enable SAML, and this red is the, so in identity provider, red means the configuration that we need to do for a service provider. And then again, whatever the certificate we have enabled here, which is this one, the same certificate needs to be in the connected app, and we already have that same certificate here. So that's all the setting at the identity provider side. Let's go on the service provider side. So here again, you have to, all you have to do is enable a single sign-on, create a single sign-on configuration, and then these blue are actually the information that we need from identity provider. So from identity provider, we need to upload identity provider certificate. This is my identity provider and this is the URL. If I go on the single sign-on, and in the single sign-on, the issuer is the identity provider's base URL, and then this URL is actually coming from the connected app. So if I go on my connected app and if I click on manage, I would be provided with lots of URL, and one of the URL is basically this URL, this one. So we use this URL here. Again, going back to the lucid chart, we have a two side, we have IDP side, we have SP side. Okay, and just to show you how it works, I'm just going to show you one demo, then I would come back to our original question on this video. So in this one, this is my service provider. In the service provider, I have another user with a federation ID like 2021 February, and here also my actual user is 2021 February. So let me log out from here. Duplicate it. I am gonna log out. So this is my service provider org. In the service provider org, I have enabled single sign-on. My single sign-on name is org29, which is this one. So I'm going to click on org29 and I would be logged in by the Meenal, which was the user that I was showing you. So if you go here, this is the user, right? Meenal that I used, which has the same federation ID. And again, just to recap you, and this is going to be very helpful for us. So again, what we are talking here right now is what's going to happen if service provider, this one gets refreshed. So as you can see, what IDP related information we have is on the blue color. So when the service provider gets refreshed, when the sandbox gets refreshed, We need to make sure that we are using same IDP certificate. We are having the same host URL of IDP, and then we have to have an IDP URL. Okay. Now the thing is, when the service provider, let's say production already have a SSO enabled, that SSO enable get copied, and we literally have to do nothing. Okay. Once the sandbox gets refreshed, all you have to do is just go back and enable the single sign-on, and these information anyways would come from the production. However, the question is, do we need to make any modifications in the identity provider itself? If sandbox URL does not change, then only SSO needs to be enabled. And when the sandbox URL will not change, of course, its name and everything remains same. The my domain of the sandbox remains same. The problem is, in IDP, we have to update ACS URL as it contains org ID of the sandbox. For an example, sandbox URL will have a same domain name as of the previous, then it would not change the URL. Even though the pod like CX62 changes to CS731, the problem is the org ID would change. So for an example, this my domain dash dash as deployed to is basically the sandbox name. It would not change. But in a single sign-on, when you enable the service provider, it appends org ID, which gets changed on the sandbox refresh. So as you can see here in my connected app, when I said that I'm going to use this identity provider, is this sandbox as an identity provider. See here the start URL. Now this is the service provider URL. In our case, it is going to be sandbox. Even after refresh, if this URL doesn't changes, that's fine. The problem is this ID would be changed, and we need to make sure after sandbox is getting refreshed, we get the new org ID and get this URL. And this URL we would be able to get it from single sign on. The moment we enable single sign on, it would show us the login URL. So if you can see here 00D, if I copy here, this is the ID of the sandbox itself. So if I'm going the company information, in company information normally it is visible what is the org ID. If I search for here, as you can see, this is the org ID. So if you have an identity provider, go back in your identity provider and make that change. Now the problem is, what if your identity provider says no, we are not going to make any change, come up with some other solution? In that case, all we can do is use another Salesforce developer org, use it as an IDP, and just repeat a step one. So really you're not making any modification in your existing IDP. If they think changing or the refreshing sandbox is too much work for them, we can use sandbox. It's my typo here. I'm saying a developer org, but developer org is not a solution because developer org has only 2 licenses. So we have to enable any existing sandbox as an IDP and make sure we are not refreshing our sandbox, just like we did here. So here we are using one Salesforce org as an IDP, another Salesforce org as a service provider. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you learned something new, or if you already knew, your concept just got validated again.